It's always interesting to know how to start a talk, because sometimes you get introduced and sometimes you have to do it yourself. I prefer not to introduce myself too much, because all the information is already on the slide. But I'd like to start with a question. Maybe you can tell me where this is. Does anyone know where this is? Maybe some of you have been lucky enough to go. I heard a few voices in the audience, sorry. Cape Town, yes, this is Cape Town, South Africa. You may possibly be able to tell from my accent, this is my original home. I grew up here, I learned all kinds of fascinating things, and as you can see from the picture, it's quite a wonderful place. If you have the opportunity to visit, I highly recommend it. Good nature, good wine, and quite a lot of sun. I was hanging out here, minding my own business, doing some things, mostly working in telecoms on the product management side. And then I got a call from a company to suggest that maybe I come and hang out here. Does anyone know where this is? I think I heard someone say Stockholm. Basically, the pitch was, come hang out in the cold and darkness in Sweden. I was invited to join a company called Spotify, where I've spent 4.5 years through all kinds of crazy, interesting things. When I joined the company, we were about 700-ish people, and when I left 4.5 years later, we were 5,000 people. That's kind of a crazy growth trajectory, and I want to kind of pitch or frame today's talk a little bit as sort of a response to a lot of what I heard and saw at conferences, where people were saying, oh, you work at Spotify, we should do those things, we would like to borrow what you do. Before I start, though, I want to tell you a little bit of a story. So, how many of you have children? Just quite a few, so hopefully the story will resonate. Young kid watching their parents cooking dinner. And as you know, a kid's favorite question to ask, of course, is always, why? Why do you do this? Yeah? Why this, why that? So the kid notices, just as the parents put the chicken in the oven, they cut a little bit off the top of the chicken, put it in the pan, stick it in the oven. Of course, the kid says, why? Why do you do this? The parents look at each other, they have no idea. We learned this from our parents. So they go ask the parents, they go ask the grandparents. Eventually, they track it down to a story that the great-grandparents tell. Say, my dears, when we first got married, we didn't have so much money. Our oven was really small. Therefore, the pan was really small. The only way to fit the chicken in the pan, you know the rest of the story. Now, I think this is a nice metaphor because a lot of what we do in our organizations is very similar to this. We borrow things from other organizations without necessarily considering how does our oven look. What is the situation that we have in our reality? So if we think about this, a big part of it is not just the reality of the oven, but also our perception of it. So for those of you who've gone through an interview process at a company, very often what you find is that when you are doing the interview process, everything is described a little bit like this oven. New, shiny, everything's good, it's all polished and neat and so on. But the reality is that perhaps once you've spent a little bit of time there, you realize that the situation is different, right? Also a good quality oven, but slightly different in approach. Sometimes what happens after you've spent a little bit of time there, you start to see maybe the honeymoon period is worn off. You realize perhaps it's a little more like this. And maybe even in occasional situations, a little bit more like this, yeah? So the question is, well, why is perception important? Now, the thing I'll put to you is basically all three of these are fantastic for cooking food, but what is possible to cook with each of these is entirely different, right? I don't know how many of you have ever tried to make a pizza in a microwave oven. It doesn't really work so well, yeah? Great for warming it up, not so good for making it in the first place. So what I want you to kind of think about here is that really the key for me is very often to start with understanding the situation that we work in and our current reality before we go grasping at solutions and ideas that are out there. And that goes for Spotify, Google, Facebook, any technology choice, whatever you're making. Yeah? So keep this in the back of your mind. So the question becomes this one. How do we move beyond this world of copy-paste agile? I'm sure all of you have worked with some kind of agile tools, methods, frameworks, this kind of a thing. Just quickly by a show of hands, how many of you would say that you're using some sort of agile in some way? And keep your hands up if you got there by a transformation. Yeah, cool. So what I want to do is explore this topic through 3 different lenses. I'm going to talk a little bit about systems, so how all of the parts of the organization fit together, and how focusing only on teams may not be the best approach. Science, which is a little bit about how do we actually understand our reality and learn from the results that we achieve. And Sapiens, because, of course, all of this is affected by the wonderful diversity of us, human beings. Yeah? So let's jump in and look at number 1. And you may have noticed around about this time is where I discovered slide animations. There are only a few. I had a lot more, and I took them out because it gets a little wild. But yeah, the topic systems, or as I've called it, interactions between your flight levels. So many of you may recognize something a little bit like this. You've worked in a number of teams, perhaps you're working across many teams, and your reality is that you're basically charging from one area to the other. We have a ton of dependencies, we have many different things between the teams. Does this look slightly familiar? You've seen something a little bit like this? Yeah? Now, for me, I think the reality is that very often what we're doing as individuals and managers and leaders in an organization is we're looking at this picture, recognizing it at some level as high utilization, but most of what we're doing is saying, well, we could be more efficient. I still see some gaps between those cars. We could slot a few more in over there and over here. And so what we do is we add more work into an already very busy system, right? Now, the challenge with this is that this is not only an issue that you face at an individual team level, but across teams, and it can compound and affect each other. So let's have a little bit of a look at this. If you look at a regular team, quite common what you will see is something a little bit like this. You visualize it in, I don't know, Trello, a whiteboard, Jira, something like this. Always this external weighting. We're dependent on somebody else. It could be marketing, a third-party company, another team in another building, something like this. The big thing that's interesting for me, though, is that if we ask this question, well, what happens when something arrives in done? Is it done for the customer? Does it actually yield value? And the short answer is that as you explore a little bit, what you start to find is that there's actually several steps between the develop and the done column. Maybe something like waiting for integration, perhaps acceptance. Maybe you have to release it as well, something like this. Yeah? And of course, we tend to do these things on a not very agile basis. We might be sprinting in weeks or something like this, but we tend to do these things a little bit more monthly and quarterly, especially as the organizations grow in size. The good news, however, is that once we get there, it's done. But as you can see, we're actually only talking about the software development backlog here on the left-hand side. It's not where the idea originated. If we want to trace something back to its origins, we have to ask a few more questions. So let's have a look. What happens before? Well, maybe there's a product backlog, some analysis work. Zoom out a bit further, maybe some idea pools, some analysis, triage, these kind of things. And we've all had that one waiting for steering committee. I've spent a lot of time waiting for this. You zoom out, and of course what you're seeing is something that is not actually very agile. The problem that I want to put to you is that focusing on being agile over here, yay, we're so fucking agile, but only over there in the software development step. Yeah? We have to think about the entire end-to-end flow if we want to actually address these challenges. Yeah? Some people solve this by saying, well, I'm a team of one, and you just do everything within that context. But often what happens is the problem space grows to be much bigger than a single person can handle. You need to collaborate with marketing, sales, finance people, this kind of thing. And so we need to think a little bit about how do we actually get ideas from reality into, or from our idea into reality. Part of the problem here is if you see this, the black line marks, or the black dots, those are where we're actually doing work, but a fair chunk of our lead time from a project or a program perspective is actually sitting waiting for something. I don't know how many of you have heard this statistic, but in a lot of organizations, that end-to-end time in the order of 12 to 36 months, and in actual fact, the working time is regularly in the space of a few weeks, actual working time. Yeah? So, why would we try to make the typing faster when the waiting is actually the problem. So, to summarize this point, the idea here is that we want to start to visualize the full end-to-end flow, right? All the way from vision to value or concept to cash, if you'll excuse me using funny buzzwordy phrases. If we cannot see the full end-to-end flow, we risk optimizing only for one step. Yeah? The second part of this is if you think about this, your organization, and you use the metaphor of a keyboard. Customer comes to us with a wish, they say, please write us a love letter, but what we've done is we've organized all the teams, each for one row on the keyboard. Now this makes some sense because not everybody has the specialists or the skills or the necessary domain knowledge to be able to do all the things. But what you tend to find happens is as the organization grows, we specialize even further, and pretty soon you've got a team for each key on the keyboard. The challenge here becomes that in order to write a love letter for the customer, what we actually need is the right team pushing the right key at the right time. There's no value in smashing that A key so hard that smoke is coming out the keyboard, you wear out the keyboard, tons and tons of A's, no love letters. Yeah? We need to flip this around. Part of what we're talking about here is establishing essentially the feedback loops between teams that can create this space where we can have a good conversation about, I need you to do this and you need to do this. We need to be able to bring those perspectives together. One nice way to visualize this, maybe some of you have seen this kind of picture before. The reality is that that shape is the same shape, but it looks different depending on where you stand. You've probably seen this before. Someone in software has a slightly different perspective on the problem to somebody who's working in marketing. It's not right or wrong, they're just standing on a slightly different angle. So this metaphor of flight levels, what it allows us to do is start to bring together the three different perspectives as we think about in an organization. Operations, teams on the ground doing the real work. Strategy, where are we trying to get to? What is the ultimate direction that we're going in? And are we going round the mountain, through the mountain, or over the top? And finally, coordination, handling dependencies across and between the different teams. If you take this picture and you start to model it out a little bit as an organizational kind of map, you land up with something a little bit like this. The metaphor is quite simple. We need all three of these different levels connected together so that each team is doing the right thing at the right time. Yeah? At the top, we have the strategy, as we said before. Level 1, we have operations, teams doing work, anything from hiring people to financial reports to building software. And in the middle, we have coordination. Now, a lot of people would look at this and say, well, this sounds a little bit like an organogram, something like that. But what we're trying to do here is not create a hierarchy for the existing structures that exist. The way that we build something like this is we say those three teams that are color-coded at the bottom, they need to do some work together. So we bring some representation from those teams, we get people in a room, and we build something that visualizes the higher level of abstraction of things we're trying to achieve. What are the projects, initiatives, programs, call it whatever you want, epics, initiatives, something like this, so that we can handle the dependencies that says, when I do this thing, and you need to do that other thing, we're going to choose this one across both of us. Yeah? We'll talk more a little bit about some of the mechanics behind this in a minute, but I want to just lightly introduce the concept. So the point I want to make here really is that we have to go beyond the team level. If we want to make an organization itself responsive to the customer needs, it's not enough to focus on how fast do we type or write software, run marketing campaigns. We have to connect the different working steps together across that end-to-end flow. So we have to go beyond the team level and start to connect strategy and operations together. So, to talk summary about systems, two ideas that I put forward here. Visualize your end-to-end flow from start to beginning, and connect the top of the organization and the bottom of the organization to the middle and through the middle. Yeah? Connect strategy and operations together. I like to always leave you with something a little bit that you can explore further. So if you're interested in exploring the topics inside the space of systems, 3 books that I can recommend to you. The first book is very general about systems, but Donella Meadows is fantastic if you work with anything to do with systems. I know some universities use this as a textbook, at least in Sweden. I think they use it at KTH and a few others. Highly recommend this book. The middle one is my partner and co-founder in the Flight Levels Academy, Klaus Leopold. It's his book of the story of the creation of these concepts. And finally, Polarity Management, talking about, well, the subtext of it is identifying and managing unsolvable problems, which I think is fantastic and speaks a lot to this. Yeah? There isn't usually a solution to a systemic problem. We can manage the dynamics. And a tiny bit of self-promotion. If you're interested to learn more about the flight levels concept, we have a self-paced course. The sign-up link is there. I will make the slides available for those of you who are interested, and you can have a little bit of a look. Maybe helps you to get a little bit of that head massage and zen out some of the chaos. So let's move on. Science. For me, this topic is about observation and experimentation. And if we put it in the context of first trying to understand how the system works together, now what we need to try to do is actually say, well, which things that we change are having effects? And specifically, which things are already having effects and which ones do we want to try to modify? So what we're talking about, essentially, to use this metaphor of a board again, you have something like this. What we're talking about, what happens when we get here? What happens when something is done? And the question for me is very often this one. Are we talking about an output or an outcome? Now, a lot of the time people say, yeah, but of course we have to have outputs in order to achieve an outcome. But so often what I see people doing is stopping after the output. We delivered the software, but we have no idea what happened. Yeah? We shipped this thing. Do people actually use it? What do they think about it? Did it solve the problem? Did it cost a lot of money? Is there something further that we could optimize or improve? Part of the challenge that we're trying to avoid here, I think, a little bit, I love XKCD, and I suspect many of you do as well. We tend to do these sort of weird extrapolations from data. We assume that we delivered something, therefore the result was achieved, or we make this kind of absurd assumption. And what I want to try to put to you is that we have to get better at understanding what is actually happening and looking at the results. Another piece of it is that very often what I see companies doing when they come up with product ideas and initiatives, for those of you familiar with the underpants gnomes from South Park, you just don't have this middle step. We're going to do something, in this case collecting underpants, and that is hopefully in phase 3 going to result in profit, but we have no idea how we actually connect the dots between those two things. Yeah? That's the piece where we need to think and start to clarify how we understand what is actually working and what we're going to do, how that is going to affect the profit on the end. Part of the challenge here, as Jonathan Haidt explores in this book, is we think of the human mind as being a logic processor. We think we reason rationally and arrive at a conclusion. When in reality, what happens is that we make a decision intuitively, and we use our rational ability to justify that decision. Right? It's not the only way we think, but we predominantly act and behave in this way. And so what we need to somehow do is start to short-circuit or sidestep this a little bit and become a little bit intentional to capture what actually am I thinking. Let's take a moment, write a hypothesis, think a little bit about what's actually happening before we jump to action. The other piece of this, a fantastic book on probabilistic thinking, Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets. She comes from a poker background, played in the World Series multiple times as a very successful poker player. But she says the challenge is that often what we do is we assess the quality of a decision based on whether or not it achieved an outcome that we think is positive. To give an example, if I won the hand of poker, therefore I must be smart. The reality is that that removes the assumption of luck or chance, right? We have to understand that there was what was actually the correlation and which part of this was having the effect. So what I want to encourage you to do, and this is especially applicable when you're working with change work. We do something like adopt a tool, we adopt a Spotify model, something like this. Write first down what is your hypothesis. If we do X, we're expecting Y to happen. And reflect, specifically as a group. Show that to some other people in your company, And if they all go, you can't convince the others around you already, even at just a base level of conversation over a coffee, a beer, a lunch, something like this, maybe you need to do a little bit further work. Some ways that I like to think about this is to say, well, if we had this thing today, what would the effect or the benefit be? If this feature existed, we would get 10,000 more signups. If we used that tool, it would automate and simplify these things. Quantify it, though. Put numbers to it. How many people are we talking? What percentage improvement? Try to be as specific as possible. You can include a range if needed, but put some information down. Because what that gives us is the opportunity to reflect. When the outcome is slightly different to what we thought would happen, we can compare that to what we were expecting. That delta, the difference between those two, that's your opportunity for learning. Another way you can think about this is to say what assumptions would need to be true in order for this to work. I see this all the time. Adopt a new standard, adopt a new tool. It'll be magic and ponies once everybody uses this, except how are you going to get everybody to use this? And usually what you end up with is 2 tools, 2 standards, 2 ways of doing things. So now you've got twice as much, or arguably more, complexity than you did the first way. Yeah? Sometimes it's better to have one than many. That's not always the case, but in this case, what will the assumptions be to make this actually work? So, quantify your hypothesis. Before you start, reflect not only when you get to the end, but as you go. Yeah? We're 6 weeks into this. Does it still make sense? Yeah? We tend to have this thing where we're always smarter in the future, but we tend to make all the decisions at the beginning when we know the least. Let's rather switch it the other way around. Defer some of the decisions for later on. And specifically ask this question of what happened after you delivered. Yeah? Don't just throw the thing over the wall, ship it into the wild. Even just on your board, have a space that says, what was the impact of this thing? It's done, it's shipped, but what happened? Yeah? Reflect on this every once in a while. The other thing that I think is interesting is to consider from this perspective. As we said, we're in the habit of saying, but there's still space, we could still squeeze one more in, we could be more efficient. One thing that I picked up that I found quite helpful is to use this metaphor of don't let number 3 block number 1. We use this quite extensively in some areas of Spotify. What we try to do here is we say, on one hand, we have this thing we want to do, on the other, we have this other thing, but let's be clear which one should win when they're in conflict with each other. Yeah? The important thing for me is not so much which one you pick, but that you pick. If you put this one first or you put that one first, most likely the first one gets done sooner, and that is better than both of them halfway done at the end of the year, end of the quarter, something like this. So this can help to avoid you making traffic jams. So I give you an example, and Olga, you might recognize this. On the right-hand side here, we have essentially an ordered list. These are the things that are explaining to the folks who meet around this board on a daily basis at the point when this photo was taken. There is a number 1, 2, 3, through 6. Yeah? And at any given point in time, I need your help on something. You're working on number 3, I'm working on number 1. It's reasonable to expect that you pause what you're doing and help out on number 1. Similarly, if you're asking for my help on number 1, maybe you already know, so you don't bother interrupting me in the first place, which would be first prize, but you would expect that I would probably say, sorry, I'm busy on number 1, let's pause and come back to this a little bit later on. So, 2 things that I suggested here. Quantify your hypothesis before you start, write it down, specifically write it down, reflect on it, and learn as you go. And, of course, don't let number 3 block number 1. Try to be clear on what actually is the priority. The good news on this one is that after you've gotten good at actually doing the number 1 thing as number 1, you can then still optimize about picking a better number 1, but doing it the other way around makes no sense if you're just going to then do everything as if it was equal. Yeah? If you want to read more about this, 3 books I can recommend. I talked about the 2 on the right already. The one on the left, Melissa Perry's fantastic book, Escaping the Build Trap, talking specifically about creating product strategy and environments where you can effectively deploy strategy and get feedback on what's working and what's not. And then a blank slide for some reason. Do you want to go back? I think someone is still taking a photo. Cool. How am I on time, by the way? My timer just says the clock. I don't have the countdown. Yeah, we're good. So, Sapiens, the wonderful diversity of human beings. The number of times that I've heard people saying something along the lines of this. Have you seen this statement? People resist change. Have you heard this one? Yeah? Or maybe the sort of more bluntly framed version of, well, they won't work on that thing or won't do it that way unless we tell them. Now, the challenge for me is that this assumes that we have essentially people in the organization who are something like dead wood, if you will. And I want to put it to you that if you have dead wood inside your company, there's only two ways that it got there. Either you hired dead wood, or you hired live wood, and you killed it. Both of those things are your responsibility to address. Yeah? A big part of the challenge here, I think, is that we tend to think about human systems in the same way that we think about machines. Yeah? Replaceable parts, fungible, interchangeable. You see it very publicly with a lot of companies going through layoffs at the moment. Just ripping people out of a team, it of course causes some kind of frustration, trauma. People connect with the people that they work with. You can't just swap one person in for another person and expect no other effects. It's not like changing the tire on your car or doing an oil change. So what is a better metaphor than this? I like to think of an ecosystem, or specifically a forest. Yeah? If you're trying to grow a forest, you can't set it quarterly KPIs and put motivational posters on the wall, get people to kind of shout at your trees until they grow nicely. This doesn't work. Yeah? What you have to do is plant at the right time. Water just enough, but not too much. Have a balance between predators and destructive species that keep each other in check and balance. Yeah? Managing an ecosystem is a fundamentally different thing to maintaining a machine. And we have to get out of that model of thinking about human beings and the human systems that we work in. Can anyone tell me what's going on in this picture? I heard it described as stale, pale, and male. For those of you not aware, that's Mike Pence in the middle, sort of pointing his hands like this. He was the vice president at the time. This, believe it or not, is Donald Trump's Council on Women's Reproductive Rights. I don't know about you, but there is no possible way that this group could make a good decision on that. Certainly not one that positively impacts the people that are actually affected by those decisions. How about this picture? Can anyone tell me what's happening here? Say again? Excellent. So, when I first saw this picture, I'll be honest, I was thinking much more, maybe it's a graduation, a wedding, some sort of family reunion. This is the ISRO, or Indian Space Agency. They've just successfully launched a Mars orbiter. They did it for less money than anyone has done it before or since, by a factor of 10. They put a satellite in orbit around Mars for less money than Hollywood made The Martian. So why do I show you this picture? Well, the point is, just like the previous one, we have biases and assumptions about the people that we interact with. The people in the previous room probably didn't even think for 1 second that they were not appropriately diverse or representative enough to be able to make a good decision. And we see this picture and we make some assumptions because Indian women specifically, we don't tend to think of as scientists. This team was predominantly women. They blew people's expectations completely out of the water, partly because of the biases and assumptions that we have about people who look like this. So I'm not going to bash you about being biased. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about why this happens. Millions of years ago, we were all roaming the plains of Africa. Something like this jumps out from behind a bush, comes charging towards you. If you sit there going, well, it's yellow, it's moving quite fast, it's coming in my direction, looks a bit hungry. Too late, you're already lunch, yeah? What we had to do was make a snap assessment, a fast fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match, and just run the hell away. If we didn't, most of us would not be standing here today because our ancestors would have been inside the line instead. So the challenge with this is that we have to learn firstly to recognize that we have some of these biases and try to intentionally design around them. We looked at one way already when we talked about the flight levels model. Bringing together strategy, operations, and coordination. I don't know how many times you've had this conversation where you just said, if only we'd spoken to the developers 6 months ago, or if we'd had a conversation with marketing, we could have avoided all of these fires that happened after we launched. Yeah? This is what we're talking about. Another piece of this is that if you are all managers, you're all men, you're all product people, you're all from the same school, you're all the same age, you're all at the same level in the organization, invite some people into that conversation who are different, right? We have to address the issue of representation first, yeah? If you cannot even be in the room, your opinion will never be heard. The second piece of this, however, though, is that it's not enough simply to address the representation or diversity issue. What we need to do is also change it so that meeting a leader doesn't feel like being the kid on the right. Yeah? You invite one developer into the boardroom to have a conversation about the future. They feel like that. You will get slightly different answers to if the person feels that they are trusted, respected, and one of the team. Plenty of other situations where this can feel that way, making suggestions, participating in a retrospective, perhaps a restructure, and one we've probably all felt is this performance review situation. So if we want to bring together these different perspectives, I want to put to you that part of the issue here is if you think about it like this. If diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is choosing the music. Yeah? And both of these are essential if we want to create an environment where we can see more of the complete whole. Yeah? I'd like to give you 2 quick examples of this in practice from my experiences at various different places. On the board, or on the slide, what you see here is a simple agenda for a check-in meeting with the leadership of an area of the company. 5 topics. What did you achieve since we last met? What are you planning to do next? What is on your minds? What are you stressed by? And which of those do you need help with? And I want to draw attention specifically to the last 3. I don't know how many of you have seen this as a leader in your organization. You make the assumption that because someone is either thinking about something or stressed by something, that they want your help with that thing. This is called inflicting help. And what we want to try to do is give people the opportunity to first ask for help, but also ask for the help that they want. The number of times after we introduced this that we found people asking for help on a totally different thing or in a totally different way helped to avoid some of that bias. I'm the leader, the manager, I need to jump in and fix things. No, I've got it covered. I'm stressed by it, but it'll be sorted by Friday. Can you go and deal with this other thing over there while I fix this? Yeah? Another example of this, many organizations bias very strongly, from my experience, more towards the verbal, but some organizations more towards the written. The challenge with this is that if I ask you something or I explain something to you, You don't get to read it later, you don't get to reflect on it. And then I go something like, are there any questions? Oh no, okay, cool, back to business. Yeah? We do this with strategy announcements, large restructures, all kinds of things. I want to suggest to you that some things that you could try to do to combat this is perhaps offer, say, some pre-reading. Yeah? Write down your idea beforehand, let people read it, come to your session where you take questions, or maybe present the idea again if it's necessary. Give people time to think, both before and afterwards, because otherwise you bias towards only the people who are comfortable having an opinion on something straight away. And as we said earlier, we tend to do a fast fit rather than a best fit pattern match, and so we've got quick judgments, not necessarily the best ones. And lastly, of course, you need to follow up. After the weekend, tomorrow morning, have a conversation. What did you think? Does this make sense? What will you do differently as a result of what I said? If the answer is nothing, so, if you'd like to read more about these topics, I can offer 3 books. First one on the left, Esther Derby's fantastic book, 7 Rules for Productive Positive Change. Esther Derby is something of a guru in this space. I hate the word, I should have used something different, but she wrote the Bible essentially on retrospectives, and this is one of her more recent books, specifically talking about making small changes for large impact and how you can do that. Multipliers by Liz Wiseman, a fantastic book, talks about how your positive traits can be problematic in other situations and how to learn to lean on others who have counterbalancing positive traits. And Humble Inquiry, specifically if you work with folks who are not used to asking questions, or you yourself would like to be able to ask better questions rather than just telling people what to do. Highly, highly recommend this. So, we posed this question at the beginning: how do we move beyond copy-paste agile? And we've explored it through the 3 different lenses. Firstly, systems, right? The interactions and feedback loops between the different levels of the organization. We've looked at it from a science perspective, the shift from output-only focus to also thinking about the outcomes so that we can quantify, reflect, and learn as we go. And finally, we looked at human beings and Sapiens. How do we design around our bias to leverage the benefits and advantages of diverse perspectives? This is how I think we create the missing links between strategy and operational agility. You can start to involve a lot more of your organization's cognitive abilities in solving the challenges and understanding the world better so that you can have more positive impact. If you'd like to find out some more, I run a YouTube show every so often. We chat to people about all kinds of interesting topics. Just Google Flight Club on YouTube. And I want to leave you with a closing thought. Very often what I hear people saying is when I talk about these kind of things, it sounds like there's a lot of money, time, investment, things like coaching, teaching, investing in our people, these kind of things, they're expensive. To me, this sounds a little bit like a question that says, well, what if we invest in them and they leave? And I want to put it to you, what if you don't and they stay? Thank you for your time. It's been wonderful chatting to all of you. I would love to hear more of your thoughts and have more conversation with you. We have some time now. I'll be hanging out here, but also reach out on LinkedIn with my very stern-looking photo. Yes. I'd love to chat more with you. Come tell me about what you think about this, what you're doing with these ideas, what your experiences have been. I'd love to chat more. Thank you so much for your time.